Esther. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, king of Persia, this is Ahasuerus that reigned, from India even to Ethiopia, over 127 provinces, that in those days, when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, that was in Shushan the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all his princes and his slaves, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces, being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. And when these days were expired, the king made a feast for all the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both for the great and small, 7 days, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white, green, and blue hangings, fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rings and pillars of marble. The beds were of gold and silver, upon a pavement of red, blue, white, and black marble. And they gave them drink in vessels of gold, the vessels being diverse one from another, and royal wine in abundance, according to the state of the king. And the drinking was according to the law, none did compel, for so the king had appointed to all the officers of his house, that they should do according to every man's pleasure. Also Vashti the queen made a feast for the women in the royal house that belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zeter, and Carcass, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, because she was beautiful to look on. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains, therefore the king was very angry, and his anger burned in him. Then the king said to the wise men, that knew the times, for so was the king's custom toward all that knew law and judgment, and the next to him was Karshena, Shether, Admatha, Tarshish, Maris, Marsena, and Mamukan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, that saw the king's face, and that sat the first in the kingdom. What will we do to Queen Vashti according to law, because she has not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains? And Mamukan answered before the king and the princes, Vashti the queen has not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes, and to all the people that are in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. Because this deed of the queen will come abroad to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes, when it will be reported that King Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. Likewise will the ladies of Persia and Media say this day to all the king's princes that have heard of the deed of the queen. So will there arise too much contempt and anger. If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes so that it may not be altered, that Vashti comes no more before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal estate to another that is better than she. And when the king's decree that he shall make will be published throughout all his empire, for it is great, all the wives will give to their husbands honor, both to great and small. And the saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Mamukan, because he sent letters into all the king's provinces, into every province according to its writing, and to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti, and what she had done, and what was decreed against her. Then the king's slaves that ministered to him said, Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, to the custody of Hegi the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them, and let the maiden that pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Yair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity that had been carried away with Jeconiah king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon had carried away. And he brought up Hadassah, that is, Esther, his uncle's daughter, because she had neither dad nor mother, and the girl was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her dad and mother were dead, took on for his own daughter. So it came to pass, when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many girls were gathered together to Shushan the palace, to the custody of Hegi, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house, to the custody of Hegi, keeper of the women. And the young girl was good in his eyes, and she received kindness before him, and he hurried her purification and her portions, to give to her, and the 7 young women who were provided, to give to her, from the house of the king, and he changed her and her young women to a good place in the house of the women. Esther had not declared her people, and her family, because Mordecai had laid a charge on her that she would not declare it, and Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house, to know how Esther did, and what should become of her. Now when every girl's turn had come to go in to King Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months, according to the custom of the women, for so were the days of their purification accomplished, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purifying of the women, then so came every girl to the king. Whatever she desired was given her to go with her out of the house of the women to the king's house. In the evening she went, and on the next day she returned into the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's chamberlain that kept the concubines. She came in to the king no more, except the king delighted in her, and that she were called by name. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, had come to go in to the king, she required nothing but what Hegai the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his house royal in the 10th month, that is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head, and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast to all his princes and his slaves, even Esther's feast, and he made a release to the provinces, and gave gifts, according to the state of the king. And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Esther had not yet shown her family nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her, because Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, the same as when she was brought up with him. In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, 2 of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were angry, and desired to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the thing became known to Mordecai, who told it to Esther the queen, and Esther spoke to the king in the name of Mordecai, and when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out, therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him, and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's slaves, that were in the king's gate, bowed, and prostrated before Haman, because the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him homage. Then the king's slaves, that were in the king's gate, said to Mordecai, Why are you transgressing the king's commandment? Now it came to pass, when they spoke daily to him, and he listened not to them, that they told Haman, to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand, because he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him homage, then was Haman full of anger. And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, because they had shown him the people of Mordecai. Therefore Haman desired to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. In the 1st month, that is, the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pure, that is, the lot, before Haman from day to day, and from month to month, to the 12th month, that is the month Adar. And Haman said to King Ahasuerus, There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. And their laws are different from all people, neither observe they the king's laws, therefore it is not for the king's profit to permit them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents, 375 tons, of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business, to bring it into the king's treasuries. Then the king took his ring from his hand, and gave it to Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said to Haman, The silver is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you. Then were the king's scribes called on the 13th day of the 1st month, and there was written according to all that Haman had commanded to the king's lieutenants, and to the governors that were over every province, and to the rulers of every people of every province according to its writing, and to every people after their language. In the name of King Ahasuerus was it written, and sealed with the king's ring. And the letters were sent by posts into all the king's provinces, to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish, all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month Adar, and to take the plunder of them for a spoil. The copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published to all people so that they should be ready against that day. The posts went out, being speeded by the king's commandment, and the decree was given in Shushan the palace. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city Shushan was in confusion. When Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes, and went out into the middle of the city, and cried with a loud and a bitter cry, and came even before the king's gate, because none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting, and weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids and her chamberlains came and told it to her. Then was the queen exceedingly grieved, and she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and to take away his sackcloth from him, but he received it not. Then called Esther for Hatak, one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had appointed to attend upon her, and gave him a commandment to Mordecai, to know what it was, and what had happened. So Hatak went out to Mordecai into the street of the city, that was before the king's gate. And Mordecai told him of all that had happened to him, and of the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews, to destroy them. Also he gave him the copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it to Esther, and to declare it to her, and to charge her that she should go in to the king, to make supplication to him, and to make request before him for her people. And Hatak came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. And Esther spoke to Hatak, and charged him for Mordecai, all the king's slaves, and the people of the king's provinces, know that whoever, whether man or woman, will come to the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put those to death, except such to whom the king will hold out the golden scepter so that one may live. But I have not been called to come in to the king these past 30 days. Then they told to Mordecai Esther's words. And Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with yourself that you will escape in the king's house, more than all the Jews. But if you keep entirely silent at this time, respite and deliverance remains to the Jews from another place, and you and the house of your fathers are destroyed, and who knows whether for a time like this you have come to the kingdom. Then Esther spoke to send back to Mordecai this answer, Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast for me, and neither eat or drink 3 days, night or day, I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in to the king, that is not according to the law, and if I die, I die. So Mordecai went his way, and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal apparel, and stood in the inner court of the king's house, opposite the king's house, and the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, opposite the gate of the house. And it was so, when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near, and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king said to her, What do you want, Queen Esther? And what is your request? It will be given to you, even half of the kingdom. And Esther answered, If it seems good to the king, let the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared for him. Then the king said, Cause Haman to hurry so that he may do as Esther has said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And the king said to Esther at the banquet of wine, What is your petition? And it will be granted you, and what is your request? Even to the half of the kingdom it will be appointed. Then answered Esther and said, My petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition, and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I will prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king has said. Then went Haman out that day joyful and with a glad heart, but when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up, nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless Haman refrained himself, and when he came home, he sent and called for his friends, and Zeresh his wife. And Haman told them of the glory of his riches, and the multitude of his children, and all the things with which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the princes and slaves of the king. Haman said moreover, Yes, Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king to the banquet that she had prepared but myself, and tomorrow I am invited to her also with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then said Zeresh his woman and all his friends to him, Let a gallows be made of 50 cubits, 75 feet, high, and tomorrow speak to the king that Mordecai may be hanged on it, then go in merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. On that night the king could not sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written, that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who desired to lay hand on King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, What honor and dignity has been done to Mordecai for this? Then the king's slaves that ministered to him replied, There has been nothing done for him. So the king replied, Who is in the court? Now Haman had come into the outward court of the king's house, to speak to the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's slaves said to him, Look, Haman stands in the court. And the king said, Let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, What will be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, To whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? Then Haman answered the king, For the man whom the king delights to honor, let the royal apparel be brought that the king uses to wear, and the horse that the king rides on, and the royal crown that is set upon his head, and let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man whom the king delights to honor. And bring him on horseback through the streets of the city, and proclaim before him, so will it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said to Haman, Hurry, and take the apparel and the horse, as you have said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew, that sits at the king's gate, let nothing fail of all that you have spoken. Then Haman took the apparel and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and brought him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaimed before him, so will it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And Mordecai came again to the king's gate. But Haman hurried to his house mourning, and having his head covered. Then Haman told Zeresh's woman and all his friends everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men and Zeresh's woman to him, If Mordecai is of the seed of the Jews, before whom you have begun to fall, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. And while they were still talking with him, the king's chamberlains came, and hurried to bring Haman to the banquet that Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman came to banquet with Esther the queen. And the king said again to Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, What is your petition, Queen Esther? And it will be granted you, and what is your request? And it will be performed, even to the half of the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request, because we are sold, I and my people to be destroyed, to be killed and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I would have held my tongue, but the adversity is not equal to the loss of the king. Then King Ahasuerus answered and said to Esther the queen, Who is he, and where is he, that does presume in his heart to do so? Then Esther replied, The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. And the king arising from the banquet of wine in his anger went into the palace garden, and Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, because he saw that there was bad determined against him by the king. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman had fallen upon the bed on which Esther was. Then the king said, Would he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbonah, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, Note also, the gallows 50 cubits, 75 feet, high that Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, stands in the house of Haman. Then the king said, Hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's anger pacified. On that day did the king Ahasuerus give the house of Haman the Jew's enemy to Esther the queen. And Mordecai came before the king, because Esther had told what he was to her. Then the king took off his ring that he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. And Esther spoke yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, and his devices that he had devised against the Jews. Then the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose, and stood before the king, and said, If it pleases the king and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews that are in all the king's provinces, because how can I endure to see the bad that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my family? Then King Ahasuerus replied to Esther the queen and to Mordecai the Jew, See, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and him they have hanged upon the gallows, because he laid his hand upon the Jews. Write also for the Jews as you like, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring, because the writing that is written in the king's name, and sealed with the king's ring, may no man reverse. Then were the king's scribes called at that time in the 3rd month, that is, the month Sivan, on the 23rd day. And it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, and to the lieutenants, and the deputies and rulers of the provinces that are from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, unto every province according to its writing, and to every people after their language. And to the Jews according to their writing and according to their language. And he wrote in the king Ahasuerus' name, and sealed it with the king's ring, and sent letters by posts on horseback, and riders on mules, camels, and young mares. Then the king granted the Jews that were in every city to gather themselves together, and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish, all the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the plunder of them for a spoil. Upon one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, namely on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month Adar. The copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published to all people, and that the Jews should be ready against that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. So the posts that rode on mules and camels went out, being speeded and pressed on by the king's commandment. And the decree was given at Shushan the palace. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, and with a great crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen and purple, and the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light, and gladness, and joy, and honor. And in every province, and in every city, wherever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews, because the fear of the Jews fell upon them. Now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put in execution, in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them, the Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, to lay hands on such as sought their hurt, and no man could withstand them, because the fear of them fell on all people. And all the rulers of the provinces, and the lieutenants, and the deputies, and officers of the king, helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. Because Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the provinces, because this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. So the Jews struck all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter, and destruction, and did what they would to those that hated them. And in Shushan the palace the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. And Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Parata, Adalia, Aradatha, Parmashta, Arasai, Ardai, and Vahezatha, the 10 sons of Haman the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, they killed, but on the booty they laid not their hand. On that day the number of those that were killed in Shushan the palace was brought before the king. Then the king said to Esther the queen, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the palace, and the 10 sons of Haman, what have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? And it will be granted you, or what is your request further? And it will be done. Then Esther said, if it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews that are in Shushan to do tomorrow also according to this day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. And the king commanded it so to be done, and the decree was given at Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. Because the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day also of the month Adar, and killed 300 men at Shushan, but on the booty they laid not their hands. But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together, and stood for their lives, and had rest from their enemies, and killed of their foes 75,000, but they laid not their hands on the booty, on the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day of the same they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews that were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day, and on the 14th, and on the 15th day of the same they rested, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages, that lived in the unwalled towns, made the 14th day of the month Adar a day of gladness and feasting, and a good day, and of sending portions one to another. Then Mordecai wrote these things, and sent letters to all the Jews that were in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, both nigh and far, to establish this among them, that they should observe the 14th day of the month Adar, and the 15th day of the same each year, as the days in which the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month that was turned to them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another, and gifts to the poor. And the Jews undertook to do as they had begun, and as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had devised against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast Pur, that is the lot, to consume them and to destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letters that his wicked device that he devised against the Jews should return upon his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore they called these days Purim after the name of Pur. Therefore for all the words of this letter, and of what they had seen concerning this matter, and that had come to them, the Jews ordained, and took upon them, and upon their seed, and upon all such as joined themselves to them, so as it should not fail, that they would observe these 2 days according to their writing, and according to their appointed time every year, and that these days should be remembered and observed throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, and that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor the memorial of them perish from their offspring. Then Esther the queen, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew, wrote with all authority, to confirm this second letter of Purim. And he sent the letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim in their times appointed, according as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had enjoined them, and as they had decreed for themselves and for their offspring, the matters of the fastings and their cry. And the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. Then the king Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land, and on the isles of the sea. And all the acts of his power and of his might, and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, with which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? Because Mordecai the Jew was next to King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his kinsmen, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all his offspring.